Well, it's a privilege to be here, and it's a surprise to see so many people. Mostly people run away from assessment and measurement and testing and numbers. But fortunately, self-assessment is something that none of that really seems to apply to. So I'm going to try and talk to you what we've learned about self-assessment. I think my work on this started with Lois Harris when she was a postdoc research fellow here. She's from Queensland, and she came over and we did some work together for 2 years. And then while I was in Hong Kong, we got asked to write a review chapter on student self-assessment for a 2013 handbook. And that confirmed a lot of my suspicions. And I'm going to share those suspicions with you, which will include what we read in the literature and what we've discovered in doing field studies with real kids and real teachers here in New Zealand. So I think none of you will be surprised, and we may all be disappointed at ourselves as a community of educators, and then we'll all have to start thinking a lot harder, I believe. Right, assessment for learning is this grand idea that assessment shouldn't just be about judging, ranking, sorting kids, but actually figuring out who needs to be taught what next. And one of the key principles of assessment for learning is learners who understand what they're doing and why they're doing it probably will learn more than kids who are confused and lost. And so many of the key strategies for assessment for learning say, let's involve students in thinking about what makes quality work. How do I know if my work is good? How do I know if someone else's work is good? And together we will learn more. But there are a lot of things that can go wrong from this lovely promise to the actual reality. The first thing about self-assessment is the word itself is kind of misleading. It's not about figuring out who am I and what am I worth. It's not about assessing myself. It's actually me assessing my work. But when I assess my work, there's always a part of me in that. And so sometimes it's very difficult to separate in assessing my work how I think about me, which might contaminate how I think about my work. And that's a serious problem for all human beings, not just kids at school. Of course I'm a great lover. I'm amazing. Yeah, right. You know? The bottom line is 50% of us are average or less in whatever skill you care to nominate. But nobody says, oh yeah, I'm really a bad driver, or I'm really substandard when it comes to being nice to people. Very few people say they're below average. And when we're asking people to judge their work, we want them, and therefore we need to teach them how to separate how you feel about yourself from how good is your work, and what are the strengths of it, what are the weaknesses in it. Your work is not you. Try telling that to a PhD student when someone says, oh, by the way, your thesis really stinks, or this article you've just written, that's really bad. And the poor writer goes, oh, my ego. Self-assessment involves two major kinds of ways of approaching it. One is to do with self-regulation of learning, which is this top diagram here, where self-regulation of learning involves what am I doing, planning, organizing, doing it, thinking about what I'm doing while I'm doing it, and then at the end thinking about, well, not only how good and how well is my product, but what were my processes like? And students who think about those things and are encouraged to think about those things are probably going to produce better work over the long run. It might not happen instantly. And notice it's always a cycle of, with this, I'm going to go on. Assessment for learning, or formative assessment, basically says, let's start with what is the task, what is the learning object, let's think about what that means, let's begin it, and let's assess ourselves, how am I going compared to the target, what I was told I had to achieve, and monitoring that, and seeking improvement opportunities, and thinking about, is that feedback from my classmate actually going to help me make it better, or is it distracting me? Is my teacher telling me something constructive and useful, and how do I make use of that? That's a really whole complicated mess of things for a kid to think about. It's not just learning the stuff, but it's also learning to manage yourself and your learning and managing your relationships with the teacher and the peers. It's not simple. Why do we bother? Well, because we do believe that learning to assess your work throughout the whole process does teach self-regulation. And we know that self-regulating people are associated with maturity, with competence to deal with complicated or new problems, actually tend to score higher on anything you care to measure. And so we want students to take responsibility. And as parents, we all want our kids to hurry up and grow up, right? You know that old line, now children, you're almost teenagers, so hurry up and grow up and act like adults, right? Anyway, we know that people who regulate themselves throughout their learning processes perform better in the long run. The other thing, as John Hattie constantly pointed out, where are you going to get feedback about yourself and your work? Well, you could wait for the teacher in a line of 30 kids waiting for the teacher to tell you, or you could start reflecting on your own work and giving yourself feedback. But of course, if you give yourself feedback, oh, I'm amazing because I did really good work and I have a beautiful shirt on, didn't you notice it? And all of this kind of self-ego stuff, you might be misleading yourself considerably. The problem with this is that it's not just kids, it's humans are bad judges. We are really bad at determining how good our work is. In fact, Dunning is the guy associated with the Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect says the less you know, the more you think you know, because you don't know that you don't know. And that happens with kids, and it happens with novices, it happens with beginners. Whether you're 70 or 50 or 30 or 10, it doesn't matter. As long as you're a beginner, you don't know that you don't know. So you think you do know when you don't know, and you don't know that you don't know, and you don't know you're wrong. Okay, so this is the problem. We tend as humans to be unrealistic. Oh yeah, I can get that done and yeah, right. No, we can't. You know, the last 20% usually takes 80% of the time. We find it difficult to imagine we're below average. We neglect for certain key things. Often we might not even know that those things are important. And this applies to teachers as well as students. It's a human condition. And when this is true, when you think about students, oh yes, you're going to self-assess. Wait a minute, will they actually realistically be able to do so? Maybe not. The other thing, as Greg House always loved to say in the TV show House, everybody lies. There is pressure to enhance your self-worth. I mean, the world is a crushing place, right? You get up in the morning and you go, oh God, I got to face it again, right? There are days when you just don't want to face reality, and life can sometimes be really hard. And so it's easy to have this really self-delusional kind of space around you where you think you're wonderful and everything is amazing and you're really good, and we exaggerate how good we are without realizing it. And if somebody says something contradictory, they can't be right. Take a look at those Simon Cowell talent shows. Everyone says, oh, he's amazing, he's amazing, he's amazing. And then Simon comes along and everyone starts booing because they know Simon's going to say, well, actually, you weren't very good. Often Simon's the only one who seems to know what's really going on. We often substitute quality for effort. I tried really hard, so it must be good. I did my best, it must be good enough. But frankly, on average, 50% of people's best is not good enough. It's not even average, right? So you can't be perfect and strong at everything. And there comes pressure. If you don't feel safe to admit, actually, I think my work's not very good, because you think someone's going to shame you or make you feel bad, then you will be in denial about how bad your work is, because you have to protect yourself. If the world is cruel to you, you have to protect yourself. And there are some societies, especially East Asian cultures, where humility is prized. And I would tend to believe that girls are socialized into being humble when they shouldn't be, and boys seem to be socialized into aggrandizing their accomplishments when maybe they shouldn't, right? So there are cultural and social factors that just influence people to either not admit that they're really good or not admit that their work isn't very good. And we have to navigate that as instructors and teachers. Here's a nice little study. You know the traffic lights. Red means, oh God, please stop. I don't understand. Yellow, I kind of got it, okay. Green, yeah, come on, hurry up. I'm bored out of my mind to do something new. Chelsea says, if you put red, you feel she, the teacher, might tell us off or something. She'll tell us to listen more or something, like we weren't listening. She always turns it against us if we're not learning. Now, I'm not trying to blame teachers, because I've been a teacher and I know how hard it is. You try your best, you do everything they taught you how to do, you do all the stuff you've learned from years, and still kids can't get it. Like, how soul-destroying is that for the teacher? I did my best, but the kids still didn't get it. So when they show me red, and I've taught it several times, and they still don't get it, yeah, I feel his sympathy for this teacher. I don't want to blame this teacher, but this teacher needs help. And that isn't going to be an easy problem to fix. Students lie. Howard said, if she says you guys have to get more detailed in your comments, Howard said, well, sometimes I just make things up. They're teacher pleasers. You know, like they'll make things up just to make you happy because, you know, they don't want you to growl at them for not understanding or not doing the job you asked them to do. Sally said, we were learning fractions. I really don't, fractions are confusing to everybody. And my colleague Lois said, well, that's okay. Did you tell the teacher? Did you put red? No, I showed orange. Why? Because Jason's looking at me and he might think I'm dumb. We put them in classes and their classmates aren't necessarily their mates. And if you don't develop that kind of environment before you start going, now show me if you don't understand, when you might be the only kid that's got red, that could be disastrous psycho-emotionally and socially for those children. And that's stuff we have to think about. The harder the stuff we're trying to teach, the more complex it is, the harder it is for anyone to judge, am I any good at this? Is my work okay? And when we're talking about learning to handwrite, that's reasonably simple. But if you're talking about learning composition, to communicate effectively in writing, to persuade someone in writing, that's a much harder job. So complex things to learn are harder to judge. Am I any good at this? And hey, teachers find it difficult to judge whether this is poor, at, above, or well below standard, so how much harder is it for kids? Certainly maturity matters. The research consistently shows that younger children are overly optimistic. Well, I suppose that's a good reason to get up and face the day because you're optimistic, right? If everyone was depressed about how bad they were, we would have a really sad society. And if kids are young and they're optimistic, we should take that into account. They're probably going to overestimate how good they are. On the other hand, as kids get older, they tend to get more realistic. Now the question is, are their marks, are their self-assessments going down because they're becoming more realistic, or is it because we're crushing the soul out of them? That's something I don't know, I don't know which one is at work, but the pattern is very clear. The more experience you have, the more realistic and less optimistic you tend to be. Unfortunately, students who are better academically tend to be more realistic also. The less you know, the more you think you know. And as students get competence, they become more realistic in their judgments about how good is my work. And certainly, there's research that shows that if you put a final year university student in a beginner class in another faculty, they're no better at judging the quality of their work than the first year students because they're still a novice in the content area. Expertise and ability really matter. Here's some examples. So you can see the kid's written a bunch of sentences and the kid self-scored it, which is fine. And the child writes, I did well with sequencing, even though I got 5 wrong. They were only the tricky ones, and I tried, which is good. Well, actually trying is not a criterion for are you able to do this work. And getting the hard ones wrong is exactly the point. You're supposed to find out, these are the hard ones, teacher, teach me. That's what's supposed to happen. The teacher has signed it. I hope that somewhere she's gone, I need to do some work on sequencing and with tricky kids, and this is one of the ones kids that needs that. I hope that's what the teacher's done. The more familiar and predictable a task is, the easier it is to judge, am I good at this? But there are studies that have shown that even 5-year-olds, how many times can you throw the beanbag into the basket? Even after they've tried and gotten very few in, they still think they're really good. It's a hard skill to learn. It's the skill to judge, is my work good, poor, what's good about it, what's weak about it. That's not how good am I, but how good is my work. That's a harder skill to learn. Mrs. Smith, she says, guessed it. Mrs. Smith, this was extremely hard. Hooray, a student has admitted they find difficulty. And I guessed some of it because I didn't get it with what looks like an unhappy face. So this student is communicating information and emotion. This student needs to be cared for and helped to fix what she doesn't understand. The teacher writes, you did so well at this. Well, what planet does this teacher live on compared to the kid? Is the kid right that they had trouble? I would have to say the kid is right. The teacher's trying to make the kid feel good, so they're substituting self-enhancement for competence development. And that's kind of sadly missing the point of why the kid is telling the teacher, yeah, I need help. Now, to trivialize this is, I understand the motivation. You don't want kids to feel sad, and you want to make that bad feeling go away. But the teacher's job is not to be the mother. The teacher's job is to help the student learn what was wrong, how to fix it. The type of criteria matters. Comparing against standards as opposed to comparing against other people leads to much more realistic self-assessments. If you have to say, how good are you compared to other 10-year-olds, the kid has no idea. How good are you compared to the other kids in the class? The kid has some idea. How good are you compared to what's written here of what you're supposed to do? Or how good is your work compared to this piece of work? They're much better at that. So, and global ratings are much easier to do realistically. Overall, how good is your work? Or how effective is your work? Is much easier than this part is right and this part is wrong. Breaking it into parts is what the teacher needs to be able to do to diagnose the need. But the kids, they're learners, they might not be able to do that so well. So again, a piece of work from the student, and the student says, I think I did well, and I got 2 around the wrong way, and I only just finished, and I talked a lot on this second session, and it was fun. Again, missing the point. Johnny, you shouldn't be talking so much, and you should be concentrating, and maybe you wouldn't get 2 round the wrong way. Now, maybe 2 wrong is not a terrible score, or a terrible result, but really the kid is making an assessment on the wrong criteria. How much fun I had, instead of, I don't understand why I didn't get it right. That's what we want the kid to engage with. Is self-assessment the answer? Well, yes, if. Self-assessment is complex. It's actually complex cognitively, it's complex emotionally and psychologically and socially. Kids don't do these things just in a room by themselves. They've got all the other classmates and the teacher around them. So in that public space, we've got to maximize. We don't laugh, we don't shame, we don't make fun of, and we help each other by commenting on what they're good at and maybe pointing out, like, what is that, 2 stars and a wish or something kind of thing. At least trying to sell more of the positive than the negative. But you've got to teach kids the goal is not make myself look good, but be realistic, to reward realism and honesty rather than just high scores, right? High scores is not the goal here. Realism is the goal. And from my point of view, I don't think we should be reporting self-assessment scores because of all the things that can go wrong. Let's just park the scoring idea. Let's park that and think of it as this is a way to develop self-regulation, a competence of being able to judge your own work realistically. And let's teach that and help kids grow in that rather than using the information to score them or report to mommy or report to the boss. And that's the goal to me, is to learn to be realistic. And if your work is outstanding, it's not your fault that you have to say, this work is outstanding. And other times you might say, but over here, I'm not so good at this part and I need help. That's what we want. And teachers have to work really hard at all of this. This is not easy work. It's not send the kids off to do self-assessment while I have a 5-minute coffee break. You have to be actively involved, but you probably knew that already. Thank you very much. If you want to read more, there's more, and Nina will share it, no doubt. Thank you. Any thoughts or comments? Yes, in the back row.
Quick question. Is it easy? So I've got students who are very over the top of, I think I can do anything because I tried that's the best thing in the world and you should reward me for that. Is the easiest thing to do to just show something that they compare their marks to and go, actually, here's those skills. They're 10 inches, they're high school students.
You know, the psychology of individuals is really tricky, so it's going to depend on that individual. Certainly, one of the things that seems to help us be more realistic is to realize, actually, unlike Tiger Woods, who's only number 400 in the world now or something, I don't even score par. That we have an index system to say we're not very good. So seeing really outstanding work and then going, oh, how is my work different? And it's really tough to figure out how to get someone to be humble about their accomplishments rather than their ego. And that, so trying to start early on separating, this is about your work, this is not about you. We know you're wonderful, we know you're amazing, you can almost walk on water, but how good is your work? You know, like that might not be the same standard as you. So we're trying to, you know, there's in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Zaphod Beeblebrox looked into the total perspective vortex, and somebody had tweaked it, and so for those few moments, he really was the most important person in the universe. So he survived, but almost everyone else has to come to the realization, I'm not the most important in the universe. It's part of growing up and maturation. And how you help young men especially get over that when they are, in training to be gods? I don't have easy answers for that. Maybe some of your colleagues have experience, but seeing what others people do. I remember watching, I don't know if you remember watching Monster Garage, and Jesse would turn to the camera and he says, this guy seems to think he knows a lot. I'm going to ask him a question, and if he says, I know what I'm doing, I'll know he's wrong. And if he says, well, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm just making it up, then, you know, like I'll know he really is an expert, because experts don't know what they're doing, they're making it up. He turned to them and he said, do you know what you're doing? And the guy said, heck no, I'm just making things up as I go along. And suddenly realized, actually experts are not bragging about how good they are. And somebody who's bragging about how good they are is not an expert. So maybe that's the kind of message we need to get people to realize. I don't know how you do that though, other than go out there and fall over 50 times before you finally get up and realize, maybe I'm not so good. It's a bad answer, but it's the only one I have. Sorry. Anyone else?
You mentioned communicating this. Do you feel that parents understand what we are trying, the way in which we're trying to develop? Because I absolutely agree that self-assessment is the way to go. It's just that I feel that in some cases parents might be mothering or fathering their children too much. So
Yeah.
when we're trying to develop self-assessment, and parents would say, well, he can't even tie his own shoelaces or whatever, you know, it's it seems as though, are we communicating to parents our initiatives or our goals clearly enough? How can we do that?
Parents, Lois Harris and I wrote an article on parents and assessment, and it's very clear that parents have a very simple worldview. More is better. So if my kid gets more than your kid, my kid is better than your kid, and if my kid gets more, and a teacher who doesn't give my kid more must be a bad teacher. You know, like and that's one of the reasons conservative parties tend to teacher bash, because there's a lot more parents who vote and have memories of bad teachers than people who vote for teachers. So teachers, you're in a awkward situation because you're easy to pick on. Yes, parents are sometimes the problem. They make Johnny feel wonderful all the time. But that's kind of, well, you really want mommy to love you unconditionally. So the teacher, I think maybe it's part of how we define what is the teacher's job here. My job is not just to destroy you or crush you, though sometimes maybe you need that. As my DP said to me when we removed corporal punishment, he said, oh God, now that I'm in this job, I wish I could hit some of these kids. So, you know, like, I understand that, but at the same time, our job is to teach you to be realistic about your competencies, and that's maybe the message we need to be giving to parents. Your job is to love them, and our job is to teach them. There is a wonderful article in Teaching and Teacher Education from 1998 by Graham and Paharis, and they interviewed kids who were in about grade 8. And kids indicated, we know the teacher's trying to make us feel good, but we really want the teacher to tell us the truth about what we're not good at and what we are good at, but only if the teacher knows what we should do about it. So that's the challenge for educators. If you're going to call the kid out and say, BS, you're not that good, you need to know, and this is what you need to do, here's the path to becoming better. So if we agreed that that's what teachers should do, rather than make kids feel good, our job is to help them become more competent, then maybe parents would join us. But I think you'll know that the good parents are already trying to teach their children how to be realistic and humble and kind and caring and not mean. You know, that's what good parents try to do.
So the independent children already are really accelerating their learning by self-assessment.
Yeah.
You've got those others who...
The weak kids and the deluded kids are the problem in self-assessment, right? I mean, we all have at certain times camped by that long river denial about ourselves and our competencies and things we should have apologized for and shouldn't have done and wish we had done. And this is just part of the human experience. So kids have this too, and their parents have this. So yeah, welcome to a complicated world where we're trying to teach kids how to be realistic about the quality of their work and not praising everything. That's mom's job. Your job is to say, yeah, how can we make that better? Yes?
One of the
Just last question, because then we'll need to move on, because otherwise you're never going to see how this all works in practice, which is an important thing to do as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Well,
Yes,
it wasn't really a question, but just following on from parents and anxiety, is that we had a student taken out of our school because the other school down the road, the kids that went there had more in their maths books than we had in our maths books, and that was one of the, and the parents' anxiety was.
You can never go wrong underestimating how little parents actually understand about what should be happening in schools, because their basis isn't, they haven't been to university to learn how to be a teacher, they went to school. That's how they learned to be a teacher. Thank you.